All right, everybody, thank you for listening to the Geeks with Wise podcast. This is episode 167. I'm your host today, Joe Barhoum, and I am joined by Blake Harris, the author of Console Wars, which is a fantastic book that you can pick up on Amazon or in stores. Blake, how are you doing?
I'm great, Joe. Thank you so much for having me on.
This is an extreme pleasure for me for many reasons. I just got done finishing your book.
Excellent.
And I really enjoyed it. So let's talk about a little bit about what the book is about. So I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. I was born in 83, so I got into the battle just like everybody else. I was in grade school and early junior high school when Sega and Nintendo were battling it out. And that's what this book is all about, is the rise of Sega and really the consistency of Nintendo.
Yeah, well, I mean, really, I'm born in 1982, so we grew up around the same time, and it really was this gigantic battle that I felt like defined who we were as kids, defined our social lives, and which side you were on meant a lot of things, not just about who your friends were, but the kind of person you were and the kind of person you aspired to be. And so the book sort of tries to take a look at what was going on behind the scenes during this entire time period. Who were the people and what were the ideas that actually led to the things that we bought in the stores and the things that we fought about on the schoolyard. So in a sense, it felt like, the 3-year research process and writing process felt like 3 years of therapy for me, finding out like, oh, that's why that happened. So it was very fun for me, not just because it was an intriguing story, but one that I was related to it. I had a personal stake in at the time. So it was really exciting.
That's super cool. So were there any moments that, you said it just now when you were describing how you got into it, that there are some times where you said, oh, that's why that happened. Are there specific things like Sonic Tuesday, the big marketing push for Sonic 2? Are there things like that where you're like, wow, that's what happened behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of things. One of the big things to think about, and it's a pretty obvious thing, is just that there was no internet back then. There's a very smaller sense of connectivity between everyone and also between consumers and the corporations that sell us things. And so, back then, it really did feel like video games came out of thin air and just sort of were released at various times, and they were. It wasn't like movies where it was like, on this Friday, this is coming out. And Sonic Tuesday was sort of the beginning of that change when there was a big Hollywood-sized budget leading up to a launch of a game. And so I did sort of remember Sonic Tuesday, and also I remembered a lot about Mortal Monday, and I was a big fan of the sports games, so I sort of remembered the EA Sports commercials. But in particular, what I sort of remembered and what sort of gave me that sense of going through therapy sessions was like I grew up. You probably had an NES at some point, like one in 3 homes in America, and trying to figure out, all right, I had a Nintendo 8-bit system. I loved that 8-bit system, but somehow I ended up with the Sega system for the 16-bit system. Why was that? And sort of going back to the themes of backward compatibility and Nintendo sort of being not very flexible with some of their business strategies, sort of helped me understand why my parents had made certain decisions and why I ended up becoming a Sega kid, even though if I had had my way, I would have been a Nintendo kid through and through.
Yeah, so I was a Nintendo kid, and I knew Sega kids, and they were different. They were different. They weren't, man, how do I put this in a way that isn't offensive? But they weren't goody-goody two-shoes, right? Like I was a suck-up, I was a teacher's pet, right? I walked a very straight line, and these kids were rowdy and wild, and they wore cool clothes, and their parents let them stay up late at night. And I mean, seriously, that it's the things that I read in your book about how Tom Kolinsky and the others on the team marketed, to this audience, the way that they came up with this marketing push and really created Sega of America. It's exactly what I would have done, right? It's so simple. The simplicity is brilliant.
No, it's true, and I was, I'm certainly being tongue in cheek with the whole therapy aspect to it, but it did feel that way, particularly with the marketing strategy and the way that I felt psychologically as a kid. And this is more in hindsight, but I remember feeling at the time, I was like you. I was a goody two shoes. I didn't like getting in trouble. I didn't really take risks. but I wanted to be the kind of person who did. Deep down I was a Mario guy, but I wanted to be a Sonic guy. And I remember feeling almost like a fraud. And that's a strange feeling to have when you're 8 years old or whatever I was, to feel like, yes, I'm a cool Sega kid who breaks the rules. But to know deep down, no, I'm not. That's just me aspiring to be this thing that was a very specific goal that they actually had in the Sega marketing department. So it was interesting to sort of see where that concept came from, and to sort of see why I felt there was this gulf between who I actually was and what I aspired to be.
Oh, that is fascinating. So something that I thought was really cool about the book is that it's really a march through time, right? Starting with when Kolinsky, who, just for everyone who, sorry, we're kind of getting deep into this conversation here. Let's just bring it back a little bit. A couple of the names you're going to hear a lot: Tom Kolinsky, Al Nilsson. We'll talk about Howard Lincoln. These are all people who were part of the, critically part of Sega and Nintendo. And there's some others. I can never pronounce her name correctly in my head.
Just call her EBVB.
EBVB, right. EBVB, who was a marketing genius over at Sega. So we'll talk about a few of these people as we go along. Tom Kolinsky was president of Sega of America. And so it starts with when he left Hasbro. Right?
Well, he left Matchbox. Let's set the stage a little bit for your listeners. For those of us anybody, whether they grew up through it or not, what appealed to me about the story was that it had a universal value, and that it almost just so happened to be set in the world of video games, but it was just an interesting underdog story. So in 1989, Nintendo was so dominant. They had become so synonymous with video games that they literally took out ads to prevent the trademark from becoming synonymous with video games, in the same way that a jacuzzi has become that way for hot tub, or Kleenex for tissues. Nintendo had over 95% of the market. Of the 30 most popular toys of 1989, 25 of them were Nintendo or Nintendo-related products. And so there was this company, Sega, that had got their butt kicked in the 8-bit battle with the Master System, and so they launched a 16-bit system, hoping that better technology would give them an edge, and it didn't really, and that came out in 1989. And then in October of 1990, Tom Kolinsky joined Sega. They still had such a small sliver of the market. And then within the next 5 years, they went on to surpass and overtake Nintendo. Tom steered the ship, but it had a lot to do with people like Al Nilsson, Ellen Beth Van Buskirk, Diane Fornacier, and also Sonic the Hedgehog and great games, and sort of the rise and fall story. That's what the book's about, and about how Sega was able to overtake Nintendo and then sort of came back down to earth and came crashing.
Yeah, that really came crashing. But and there's some really cool just insider stories that you learned when you were writing this book. So talk to me about the interview process and the folks that, how did you get access to all these people?
By trying really hard. I mean, this is my first book, and a lot of the process was figuring out as I went along. So I'll tell you how I even just got into writing it, because I think that's sort of indicative of how the whole process played out. And that was because, like you, I grew up during this era. And almost 4 years ago now, for Christmas, for my birthday, actually, my brother got me a Sega Genesis, which is what we had when we were kids. And it really got me thinking about this time in my life, how big of a deal Sega versus Nintendo really was. And unlike other corporate rivalries, whether it's Coke and Pepsi or Reebok and Nike or Google and Apple today, it felt like it was something more than just a brand affiliation. It felt like it was a personality indicator, the way you were describing earlier, that Sega people really were different. So I was curious what was going on behind the scenes and why video games seemed to have this unique corporate identity that other products didn't. And so before I wrote Console Wars, I really just wanted to read about Console Wars. And after a trip to Barnes & Noble, I found that not only was there no book on the subject, but there were so few books about the video game industry out there. I went to the flagship Barnes & Noble in Manhattan, this 2-story gigantic store, and they didn't have a single book in the entire store about video games, the history of, the business of video games. All they had was walkthrough guides. And so I thought that was kind of odd. And from there, I bought the few books that were out there, whether they were published by small presses or whether they were just out of print. And I sort of began to see what the story was here. And all I can conclude was that the only reason the book hadn't been written was because, the business side seemed interesting, but maybe the people were boring or the story itself wasn't that compelling. But I was able to get in touch with Tom Kolinsky. That was a difficult process because I had never written a book before, and my background was in screenwriting, and it wasn't a very particularly successful one in screenwriting. But I made several appeals to Tom, and as he is in the book, he's just a really great, genuine guy who knows when to take risks, and he was willing to take a risk and speak with me. And after speaking with him for our first conversation, which lasted a couple hours, I knew that I wanted to spend the next few years of my life writing about the story because I was just so blown away by everything he had to say. And not even just, his time at Sega, but we spent the first 45 minutes talking about what he did before Sega. I found out that he was involved with helping to develop the Flintstones Kids Chewable Vitamins, reviving the Barbie doll, helping to create He-Man Masters of the Universe, and so many iconic toys and brands from my childhood, and this was all before Sega. So I was just kind of blown away by Tom, and then I set out to write this book. And strangely, the best resource for me early on was one that I used to make a lot of fun of, and I still sort of do it. But LinkedIn. Do you ever use LinkedIn?
I am over 1,500 connections, so I don't make fun of LinkedIn. I use it primarily for my work.
Yeah, and so. I still make fun of LinkedIn because they still send me the strangest emails and congratulate people on the work anniversaries and strange things like that. But it is a great resource, and it was extremely helpful to me because, I didn't know anybody. I also had never written a book of this, or have never written a book, and I never really undertaken a story of this scope. And so I just typed in Sega and Nintendo, and I saw who was there and what years they were there, and then it was just a numbers game. About 15% of people would respond to me. And early on, and even to this day, I'm so fascinated by that time period, I'd be willing to speak with anyone, whether they were a janitor for one day at Sega or whether they were the executive vice president. So there was nobody I wasn't willing to speak with, and I sort of just built it out from there. And, as frustrating as it was that the process took 3 years while I was going through it, looking back, that was the best thing that could have happened to me. That was why there was such a richness to the book, and why I felt like I was able to get the kind of access that I did, just because of that time period. In some cases, that helped me, that gave me enough time to finally get some interviews that took me years to procure, and in other cases, it just helped me build a relationship with people like Tom or Al, where someone for 3 years, and it's they are willing to share more intimate thoughts with you as they begin to trust you.
So how does that work? I mean, that's a great lead into this conversation. So how does that work? Tom Kolinsky, you found him on LinkedIn. You found all these people on LinkedIn, and I don't want to make this a LinkedIn commercial, but you need more than just one piece of this giant puzzle to bring this thing together. And you mentioned already that it took a couple of years to write the book. So was there ever a point midway through where you had 80% of the pieces and felt, well, I've got something complete, or man, if I really had that other 20%, then I can have this other more complete story? Did you start to learn what the missing pieces were as you were going along?
Yeah, that's a great question, and two things come to mind when you ask. One is that the fun thing and also the difficult thing of writing a nonfiction book, of a scope like this, of a 6-year period, and with so many people involved, is that I'm putting together this puzzle, but there's no box to know what the puzzle looks like or what it should look like in the end. So one thing that was invaluable to me was these relationships with these people, because I would show them the links that I was putting together and ask for their feedback. I wanted it to be collaborative in that sense, not just because, as we'll talk about later, the style of the book, but I also wanted them to help fill in blanks or to tell me, oh, you should talk to this person, you should get this piece. So there was a lot of times when I didn't necessarily know what it was that I was building, but speaking with Tom and Al and Shinobu and Paul and everyone helped me really focus it and figure out where to go next. But there was also a sense that I was missing 20% of the puzzle or some percentage of the puzzle, and really only basically just missing a large vantage point into the story. All right. Perfect. Okay, so just to confirm, it looks like there's a second audio track below the top one, and now it's recording from that point forward, and I can see the little blue streaks happening while I speak. Is that correct?
That is perfect.
Okay, great. So I don't know if you want to keep this little melee as part of the show, but I'll just dive back in, and I'll just keep explaining what I was saying about the other percentage of the puzzle.
Yep, and I'll just piece it together. No problem.
Okay. So, one of the big challenges for me was figuring out what the puzzle was of the story that I was telling, but at the same time, there was the concern that you mentioned about, am I missing pieces to this puzzle, and what is there other parts of the story? And for me, for the most part, that was really Nintendo. As described in the book, Nintendo is a very tight-lipped company, a very tough nut to crack, and that was true for me as a writer and an investigative journalist trying to get access to them and figure out what was going on behind the scenes.
Yep,
and it really was a very long and difficult process. I was declined for a couple of years to speak with people like Howard Lincoln and Mr. Arakawa and Peter Main and some of the executives from back in that time. A lot of it, too, is because, in addition to Nintendo's unique corporate DNA, the people that I spoke with from Sega, Sega really was back then sort of one of the early Silicon Valley type companies. It was in the Bay Area, and it was an innovative company, and there was a lot of turnover. So people who worked at Sega of America tended to not spend their careers there, but to spend a 3 to 5 year chunk of their life. So, I mentioned this because when I spoke with them now, they were no longer affiliated with Sega, whereas the Nintendo folks, some of them still worked for Nintendo, and the ones that didn't had worked there for about 25 years, so they still felt like they were part of the Nintendo family, and, I can understand their perspective. Why would I want to speak to this nobody that they'd never heard of before and potentially risk or jeopardize, upsetting Nintendo. But to Nintendo's credit, though it did take a very long time to get the access I wanted, I eventually was able to speak with Nintendo corporate. They came out to meet me. We developed a relationship, spoke back and forth, and eventually I was able to get interviews with all the people that I wanted to. So in the end, it worked out, though it wasn't until the last month of writing the book. And so, there was only so much that I could add, but I definitely spent that month writing a lot to add as much as I could.
So it wouldn't be linear, though, right? Because you're writing a book that's fairly linear in the way it takes place, but the way you got the information and the different sides of the story isn't linear. So what's that process like to go back and inject content from Nintendo? That's something you may have written 8 or 9 or 10 months before.
Well, that's a good question. I think that whether this is just me justifying my own actions or trying to, come up with a blessing in disguise concept to how life actually played out, for the most part, the first half of the book is almost exclusively Sega, and part of that was due to a lack of access, but part of that, too, I think, was due to the fact that what's most compelling about this is the underdog story, the idea of the disruptor coming in and changing the industry. And so there wasn't that much from Nintendo during this time period that I necessarily would have wanted to see. I wanted to stay very much in the room and in the space and in the minds of the people at Sega. So whether, like I said, whether that was a justification or just how things turned out, for the most part, the first half of the story I wanted to be mostly focused on just Sega and seeing Nintendo from their perspective, where Nintendo was just this gigantic bully that wanted to ruin people's lives and, the way that Sega saw it. And then throughout the second half of the book sort of describe where the different way of looking at Nintendo, that, maybe they're not so bad after all, or maybe they are so bad, but there's a reason why they are bad in these ways.
Yeah, and you ended the book in such a great way, bringing everything full circle, and then the letter that Howard Lincoln wrote. Because to me, I'm reading this book, and I plowed through the last 180 and 190 pages in one sitting, and which I'll explain in a minute how that happened. And my wife was amazed. I'm not known for this. Anyway, so I was reading it, and I'm like, God, I hate Nintendo, right? these jerks, they ruined my childhood and I didn't even know it. And like how great of a story it is, the underdog portion of the Sega story is so amazing and compelling, and everything that represents me now as an adult. I'm a sales professional, I'm an underdog in every minute of my job. And I get that. And the marketing aspect of it, like I'm constantly thinking of new ways to market my company, and it's like, this is me. I relate to Kolinsky and team. I am these people. And then you start to read about the very quick decline of Sega, which was really a result of the Civil War between Sega of America and Sega of Japan. and how everyone just starts dropping like flies. All these great people you read about that spent 3, 4, 5, 6 years at Sega, they start leaving, and then all of a sudden it's really just Kolinsky by himself from the recognizable names at Sega of America. He leaves, it goes full circle, he picks up where he left off at the beginning of the book, and then you get this letter, right? Or he gets this letter in the mail from Howard Lincoln, and to me, it completely redeems Nintendo, which I don't know if others will feel like it completely redeems them, but it was just a nice way to end the story.
Yeah, it was perfect, and Howard Lincoln thought it was perfect, and Tom thought it was perfect, which is, in the end, I'm just trying to do right by them. So that felt right to me. I would hope that there was some more redemption for Nintendo before then, but yeah, I thought that was the perfect ending to show. It was a very respectful letter from Howard Lincoln, the president of Nintendo of America, to Tom, saying, I'm sorry to hear you're leaving the industry, and, congratulations on doing such a great job, often at our own expense. And just sort of puts human faces to this corporate battle. And, I would issue a spoiler alert, but I think it's just important, even going into the book, to know that this was a furious fight, but there were level-headed men behind the scenes, and that they did have respect for one another.
Right, but there are some good moments in the story where, towards the end, where, things got a little heated between them, which was really neat.
Absolutely. It never resorted to physical violence, but it almost did. One of my favorite stories is between Tom Kolinsky and Peter Main, the executive vice president of sales and marketing at Nintendo, and almost getting into a fist fight on the streets of New York City while it's snowing outside.
And I love how Kolinsky storms off north, right, up the street in the snow, and then you end the chapter with, well, maybe he just did that to catch the taxi so that Peter Main couldn't.
That would be a Sega awesome thing to do. But I will say, while it was important for me to end the book with that letter and show that there was this reflective aspect to the people, even as they were going through it, and this level of respect, as somebody who did interview over 200 people from Sega and Nintendo, 20 years later, or however many years it's been, I will say that there was not very much respect that carried through, which made it fun for me, because the people from Sega really don't like the people from Nintendo still, and vice versa. Going into writing this book, I expected, that I sort of compared it in my head to the rivalry between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, where it's two great competitors who at first maybe didn't like each other, but as they go through these battles, they sort of develop the respect and become friends or have this strange rapport. That was really not the case here. Howard Lincoln did have a certain respect for Tom, and some of the people did have a respect for some of these people in an abstract sense. But when I ask them questions, they fall right back into their old roles, and they seem to have a major distaste for one another.
That's fascinating.
So that was really fun for me.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. It's an incredible book, and I just encourage everyone to pick it up. And so, because it would just make this conversation even better for the listener, I think, if they've read the book or portions of it. So keep that in mind. Bookmark this in your Stitcher profile or iTunes or wherever. Episode 167 got you interested in the book, you bought the book, and then you came back and listened to it again, and then you tried to track down Blake Harris on LinkedIn so you can ask him some more questions. So let me tell you how I finished the book. It's the worst of circumstances, but I'm so glad I finally got to. So I'm a Kindle guy, so I've got it everywhere. It's always on me. All of my books are. And I'm kind of a slow reader because I like to also play video games. And sometimes it's, do I play a game or do I read a book? What do I do? And I have a young daughter at home, so free time doesn't come very often. But I travel a lot, and that's usually when I get those two things accomplished. So literally yesterday, I've got 200 pages left. And I feel like I have enough information to have a conversation with you, but I really wanted to finish it. So my mission was, I'm going to read on the plane. I had a flight to San Francisco from Portland. It's about just under 2 hours. Yeah, I'm going to finish the book. 2 hours, 200 pages, done. Get on the plane, start reading. About 3.5 hours later, we land in San Francisco. So there was some fog in SFO, which if you've ever flown to SFO, you probably figured I was going to say that.
Yeah.
But that's the reason I didn't, I got to finish the book. It was classic SFO weather. But the cool thing was I didn't even notice because I was really into the book, and it kept me going. So thank you, Blake.
That's like
Thank you for getting
the
me through that
greatest
flight.
compliment of all, to know that I made such a tedious and frustrating experience not so tedious and frustrating. But
Yeah.
but that it's good that you know it's nice to hear, of course, that you finished the book, because I love the book and I wrote the book. But I too, I was up till 4 a.m. last night finishing a book, and I also had about 200 pages. And isn't that such a great feeling when you know that you're actually going to get to the end of something? You know, like I remember when it was like 2:30 a.m. and I only had 60 pages to go, and I was like, I'm actually going to finish it tonight. I'm not going to just put it aside. Like this is it. I love that feeling when you know you're going to get to the end of a book.
Yeah. It gets you motivating to just, like, if you're tired but you only got 30 pages left, it's like, but I
Yeah,
gotta know how it ends.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So you said you were a screenwriter before you were an author, before you wrote this book. Now that you've written this book, what's next for you?
Well, I would definitely want to qualify that by saying an unsuccessful screenwriter, or at least I was successful enough to have a representation, which was helpful in helping me get this book off the ground, and also in helping to put together the film components for the documentary and feature film for this for Console Wars. So what's next for me is mostly the film components. So in addition to writing the Console Wars book, I'm also, and I have been, co-directing a documentary based on the book, or based on the battle between Sega and Nintendo, with Jonah Tulis, my longtime business partner. And we are directing the movie for our wonderful producers, Seth Rogen, Evan Goldberg, and Scott Rudin. And those guys are also not just producing the documentary, but Seth and Evan are attached to write and direct the feature film dramatization of the book, and Scott is producing that as well. So for the most part, since finishing the book and while writing the book, I'm focused on the documentary, and now we're starting to sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I'm starting to look at what I will be writing about next, and it's nice to try to get back to writing. And then in the meantime, I've also been writing some shorter stories and articles about the subject matter about video games. Because as the book is 550 plus pages, but surprisingly, I still think it's a pretty lean story, and there was so much interesting stuff that I left out. Not because it was dull or uninteresting, but I really wanted to make sure that there was a central narrative that drove the story, which for the most part was sort of Tom's experiences at Sega, but also just this battle between Sega and Nintendo. So while there were a lot of fascinating things that didn't really fit into the narrative in the direction it was going, they're very interesting in their own right, and deserve to be told. So I'm trying to write some of those stories as well.
That's cool. And so did you have to, of that information, of that part of the story that didn't get into the main book, for the next portion, will that be with any new players and new characters, people that we didn't really see much of in the first book?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm still kind of shocked that when I walked into that Barnes and Noble 4 years ago, or 3.5 years ago, that there wasn't an entire video game history section, and biographies and books written about some of these people. So some of the stories that I want to tell are just the fact that, as much as Al Nilsson or EBVB are in the book, there's still hundreds of pages worth of stories that you could tell about these individual people. And then there's some that, people were behind the scenes, or who are only mentioned once, that have such fascinating stories. I think a good example is Sam Borofsky. He's mentioned in the History of Nintendo section. He was Nintendo of America's first sales rep. He was the guy who introduced the Nintendo Entertainment System, the 8-bit system, and the Robot Rob to America. And this was at a time following the video game crash. And so I wrote the story about my friend Sam. I got really close to him over the past couple of years, and he passed away a month or 2 months ago. And so I really wanted to write a tribute to him, and sort of share some of the letters that he had shared with me. And so it ended up, there's a nice story about Sam that was published on IGN, called The History of Nintendo's Secret Weapon. And that's just a good example of, in a way, it was hard because Sam became a friend, and he's only mentioned in maybe 2 pages worth of content in this book. But as you see from that article, there could be a whole book written about Sam, or I could gush over him for several pages as well. So, I sort of looking at this whole thing from a step back, and sort of more abstractly, a lot of what I wanted to do here was to create a very accessible book for people who either read a lot or don't read a lot, or people who play video games a lot or don't play video games a lot, and sort of introduce people to this video game world. And I'm not the first person to write a video game book, but I did want to be the first to write an extremely accessible one that could be read by anybody, and sort of shine a light on this industry and get others to read about it and write about it as well.
Yeah, I would definitely say mission accomplished.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not much of a reader. I have a few odd reading trophies. I've read all of Game of Thrones. That's pretty weird for a guy who doesn't read a lot. And then, of course, Console Wars. I can't think of many other trophies lately in the last few years for me in reading, but definitely mission accomplished. It is a fascinating story, and for people who, it's pretty obvious if you're into gaming, you'll definitely enjoy this book. So, talk to me a little bit about your own gaming habits. Obviously, you're busy writing, and now getting ready to get involved with this movie about Console Wars. But do you video game at all? What's your gaming
so my
habit
own
like?
video game habits, and part of the reason that I wanted to write the story for gamers and non-gamers alike is because when I first started 4 years ago, I was not a gamer. I wouldn't have considered myself a gamer anymore. I played Sega, Nintendo, and PlayStation back in the early 90s because that's what you did to survive. I don't even think the label gamer was around. It was, you were a kid, that's what you did. You went to people's houses. When I was thinking about the book and sort of thinking about what it meant to play video games back then, I sort of liked this idea that it was the social lubricant of our generation. I wouldn't invite a friend over to talk about girls. I would invite him over to play video games, and then we would talk about girls. I played video games. It was a large part of my life in the 90s. And then I think that probably between high school and college, I stopped playing a lot. And part of that was because I realized that I had left this giant hole in my life of when I stopped reading and I stopped really doing anything other than watching television, watching syndicated television and Saved by the Bell reruns. So I started reading a lot and writing a lot, and so that took up a large chunk of my life. But as I rediscovered my joy for video games and just my love of the art form 4 years ago or so, I did get back into playing them, and I first bought a PS3, and now I have a Wii U, and I definitely like to go on video game benders when I am not sort of down the rabbit hole, but I have been for the past since the book came out in May. It's been very hard to find time to play, though I have enjoyed playing Mario Kart 8 as a stress release.
Yeah, Mario Kart 8 is pretty sweet. We actually just recently posted a review on that on our site. I'd be interested to get your feedback and see if what we wrote aligns with your experience in the game. But do you see any similarities today in today's gaming market that you've learned from writing this book, between Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels, and there's a lot that's different, and it's interesting to look at both things. I think that in terms of what's the same, it's obviously various video game hardware makers competing for your money, but it's interesting. It's interesting to see this happening in an environment where there is also a casual gaming industry growing very quickly, mobile gaming industry, and it's also interesting to see this battle between Sony and Microsoft, and Nintendo is sort of on the outside looking in. And one of the first things that come to mind is that this battle between Sega and Nintendo from the early 90s, whether or not, despite the fact that Sega was not very successful sort of going into the battle, they did have a 20-plus year pedigree in video games. They were an arcade, a coin-op company, from starting in the mid-1960s. So they had 25-plus years of experience making video games, whereas and Nintendo had 10 or 15-plus years. So basically, the point is that in the early 90s, when it was Sega versus Nintendo, it was two video game companies. And nowadays, the two big players are Sony and Microsoft. And not to say that they don't make great games, because they do. But both of those companies are rather new to the video game industry. They're actually big conglomerates, one with a background in consumer electronics and one with a background in computers. And I think that kind of speaks to how the game has changed so much. Back in the early 90s, the cost of making a game was at most $1 million and involved teams of between 1 and 5 people. Nowadays, it's much like Hollywood with multi-million dollar budgets, and just, the barrier of entry is so much higher. And it's interesting that the ones that are able to withstand and sustain those costs are non-video game companies. And I think that to some extent, that's part of what has hurt Nintendo, or I guess hurt their perception and maybe even hurt them financially. Though I think that Nintendo's doing exactly what you would expect them to do after reading this book.
Yes.
So
yeah,
I don't I think that it's very easy to declare, especially 6 months ago, that Nintendo is losing the console wars, or is Nintendo done? Are they gonna, is this their last generation? But sort of looking at it through the lens of what you've learned in the book and what I learned researching it, I would almost argue that Nintendo is exactly where they want to be, and they're going to kind of just keep doing what they're doing, and sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't work, but they create a certain type of entertainment that, yes, it's a video game, but it's not the same kind of thing that Sony and Microsoft are doing, and it's because they don't want it to be. That's just not what they're about.
Yeah, you nailed it right there. Ever since having read the book, at this time right now, it's December 7th, and yesterday was the kickoff of PlayStation Experience in Vegas, and then just 2 days ago were the Video Game Awards, and Nintendo showed footage from Star Fox and from the new Zelda game. And sitting right there are Shigeru Miyamoto and Ian I can't pronounce his name, Anamura. And they're sitting right there next to each other, the two greatest game creators from Nintendo, sitting down just all smiles playing their games, and the games look fun. These guys look like they're having a great time. It seems so genuine, and I'm just like, this is totally the same two people that I read about in the book. This is Nintendo.
Yeah, it is Nintendo, and that's one of my favorite parts of the book, or people reading the book, is, the book only technically goes up to 1996, but you can really extrapolate between the Civil War at Sega and just sort of the corporate identity of Nintendo, why things happen the way they have the past 20 years. The only thing different I could have seen playing out for Nintendo is if you look at them sort of in the conceit of being the same as Disney in the way that, in the 80s, there were great movies like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and also, I don't know why that was the first one that came to mind, but there's all sorts of great live action movies, and Disney was making Disney movies, animated movies, and you could say yes, they went to the same box office and they were successful, and they were competing against movies like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but they were sort of their own thing. But the interesting thing is Disney is also a big corporation, and they also, now they own Marvel or are affiliated with Marvel, and they also they have, I believe, Touchstone Pictures, which did more adult content. So that was probably a pretty laborious way of me saying the only thing I could have seen different for Nintendo is if they had acquired other companies and sort of Nintendo, the brand name, remained just this kid-centric, family-friendly company, but somehow they were involved with creating older skewed games or older skewed entertainment, but that's not a road that they wanted to go down.
Yeah, and that was another central part of the story was Night Trap and the Sega CD. As soon as I read Night Trap, all these memories came to my mind. Like, oh, that smut! I can't believe that's in the book. That I can't believe that was important. Let me put it that way.
I can't believe it was important either. So for those of you who don't know or don't remember, in December of 1993, there were Senate subcommittee hearings led by Senator Joseph Lieberman that basically pitted Sega against Nintendo and brought them before Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. to discuss violence in video games. And what spurred these hearings, probably in the cultural zeitgeist, was Mortal Kombat, and the fact that Sega's game had a blood code that allowed it to be as gory as the original arcade version, whereas Nintendo censored it. But sort of the other big game, and the one that was talked about a lot during the hearings, was this game called Night Trap, which was a live action game, full motion video FMV, and it was basically like a choose your own adventure movie, and that constituted a video game. The fact that you could interact with this movie, and it was a terrible movie. It was terrible. And what's so funny about it is, like you described, this is relevant. This stupid game is part of what's prompted the hearings. Is that the hearings were in December of 1993, but the game was made in 87 or 88, and it was actually originally made for Hasbro for their never ever mention outside of the office Nemo product. And Sega ended up with it because they made a deal with Sony to sort of just try to be their friends, and they split up the products, and Sega ended up taking Night Trap, and Sony took Sewer Shark, and it was like this strange sequence of events for a game that was 6 years old, and it's such a stupid game, ended up leading to these hearings. It was just pretty funny.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely something people should read about. But you just remind me of something. Would Sony exist the way they do if it weren't for Olaf Olafsson and Tom Kolinsky trying to work together?
I don't think so. And you know, I would like to have an asterisk beside that saying that, you know, these are not the people responsible for the hardware that ended up being so successful, and Ken Kutaragi from Sony deserves an enormous amount of credit,
right.
as do hundreds of other people. But you know, Olaf is a really great example of what makes this story special, what makes it relevant to today, what really starts to make you ask and answer those questions of what if and what if not. And also, so sort of going back, you'd mentioned that the one of the other few books that you've read recently was Game of Thrones. And to me, Console Wars, that was probably the biggest inspiration in writing the book, was Game of Thrones, which maybe you wouldn't expect given that it's a fictional story. But to me, this was all just really a big Game of Thrones. Nintendo thought that the throne was their birthright. Sega thought that they didn't deserve to have it anymore, and Sony had their own perspective on the matter. But the reason that I mentioned it is because speaking with Olaf Olafsson, who was the head of Sony Publishing Entertainment, which was their software division at the time, and it helped lead the charge for hardware division. Speaking with Olaf is really what opened my eyes to this idea of what, you know, I think that what makes Game of Thrones the books great, aside from the action and sort of the history of Westeros and all the, you know, all these fictional places, is that the way that the book is put together is that it's sort of a collision of different narratives, right? It's different vantage points to the same story, and each time you're reading a chapter, it's a different perspective, and it tells you ahead of time who that perspective is. And though all the stories are told in the third person, they're not first person narratives, you do get a sense that you're inside the head of a certain person and that you're seeing the history from that person's point of view. Whether it's the way that they think or the way that they talk or the way that they refer to characters. And speaking with Olaf really opened my eyes to that fact because, you know, Sony was kind of famously left at the altar at the 1991 summer CES by Nintendo. And everyone prior to my speaking with Olaf had told me that he was furious and that he hated Nintendo and he vowed revenge. And when I spoke with him, I heard a very different story. And he was saying that he almost found it amusing, that he found it, in a sense, liberating, that he didn't have to work with Nintendo. And also, he took it as a challenge, and that a challenge that ended up, I would argue, in Sony having the role they are today. But it was important to me because I could understand from everyone's perspective why they would assume that Olaf and Sony would be upset and why they would be furious and why they would vow revenge. But that was not what Olaf was telling me. And I also could understand it from his perspective of why he reacted the way he did. And that's sort of just really made, you know, maybe this is a no-duh epiphany, but the idea that, you know, to confine history to just, you know, to assertions and to say that it was one way or the other is really a dangerous game. And you know, I think the best kind of history is the kind presented of Game of Thrones, where it's almost like a he said, she said history, where one person has their perspective, another person has their perspective, and there's a synthesis that comes together that gives you a better sense of reality. But it was important to see the perspective from Tom and Sega, or from Al at Sega, and from Sony and Olaf and Howard Lincoln and Peter at Nintendo. And I think that plays a key role in the book in understanding Sega and Nintendo. And so when I wrote the sections from Sega's perspective, I sincerely hated Nintendo. And when I wrote the Nintendo sections, I sincerely hated Sega. And I just tried to sort of really see the history from these people's points of view in order to try to deliver a larger sense of history and just a different sides of the coin. And Game of Thrones was a big inspiration for me, and that was all sort of prompted by speaking with Olaf.
That's pretty sweet. So it sounds like in the book that Olaf and Kolinsky are pretty good friends. Are they still good friends?
Um, yes and no. Well, that sort of gets to one of the most fun parts of writing the book. In a sense, writing the book and interviewing 200 plus people from this thing that happened 20 years ago made me a little bit of an assassin hunting these people down. But it also kind of made me feel like I was the head of the high school reunion committee. And so I got, after hunting these people down, I would talk to Tom and say, "Oh, hey, Tom, I spoke to Olaf today and he mentioned this," or "Hey, Olaf, Tom said this." And they would say, "Oh, how is Olaf?" And I would say, "Oh, wow. I imagine you guys as best friends, but you guys actually haven't spoken in about 10 years. So I got to
Wow.
put Tom and Olaf back in touch, got to put a lot of people back in touch. And so that was a really fun side role for me. So Tom and Olaf had a close relationship during their times at Sega and Sony. It did almost lead to what would have been the Sega PlayStation, and it also partially led to the Sony PlayStation. But they haven't really kept that much in touch. But they have been speaking the past year, and it's nice to be able to see that happening because they're both people that I admire a great deal.
What's Olaf up to these days?
Olaf works at Time Warner, and he's actually one of the few people who are in New York, are based in New York. Most of them were either based in Seattle or based in the Bay Area. So I got to spend a good amount of time in person with Olaf since I'm in New York. And he's as interesting as ever. His path, as you'll see in the book, was that he was trained. He's from Iceland. He has a wonderful name, Olaf Olafsson. He was trained to be a physicist, but decided that that's not the path that he wanted to go down and got into computers and consumer electronics. And all the while, these past 20 years, while he's been moving up the corporate ladder, he's also continued to be sort of a Renaissance man. He's a writer. He's written 4 novels, one of which I'm looking at right now called Restoration. And he's just a brilliant writer, a great conversationalist. And at the same time, as much as I love and admire Olaf, I still always get the sense whenever I'm around him that he is sort of like a James Bond villain. Just the way that he talks and the way that he looks and how he doesn't emote very much and how he has this strange little accent. He's just a really fun guy to be around, a really smart guy.
I love that. So did you ever have interviews that weren't one-on-one? Maybe you had 2 people together and interviewed them at the same time?
Not by design, though it happened a lot. Just as I played this role of a union organizer and more people would meet, and sometimes it would happen if I was going to San Francisco and they would, we'd have dinner with a few people. And that was great as well because, for me, I spent 3 years researching this and I was able to get. There was a point where I felt like I had all of the content historically and anecdotally that I wanted, but I felt like I could never have enough understanding of who these people are, whether it's mannerisms or just the way that they interact and, sort of the chemistry aspects to it. So seeing them in person, seeing them, how they interacted with others, was always really helpful as well.
So I'm wondering what the response has been by not only the people you've interviewed, but just other people in the industry today. Now that the book is out, what are people saying?
They're saying a lot of different things. Well, it's mostly good things. I think the book has been very successful. It has certainly exceeded my expectations in terms of sales and just critical response. But I guess there's a lot of ways to answer the question. First off, talking about the industry and talking about the people is the most important because, I spent years writing this book and spent years thinking about it and researching it. But at the end of the day, I have no illusions that I was not the one that lived through the story. These are other people's stories that they've been kind enough to entrust me with. So priority number 1 for me is doing right by them and making sure they're happy with the book. And I couldn't be happier with the response. They love the book. They continue to support the book. I had a panel at San Diego Comic-Con this year with Tom Kolinsky, Al Nilsson, Perrin Kaplan from Nintendo, and Bill White, who is at Sega and Nintendo. So it's great that these people continue to support the book and continue to be pleased with the work, and it wasn't just like it was published and everyone said, "How dare you? I can't believe you did that." And I think the response from the industry has been very strong as well. I got a lot of responses, some on LinkedIn and some just through Twitter and email from people in the industry who either are part of it now and are glad that I've helped to shine a light on it, or people who lived through it and said, "Oh my God, you so perfectly captured Howard Lincoln. I totally remember him being like that." So that response has been very strong. Perhaps what I didn't expect was from the critical response. The book was praised very highly by some places like Publishers Weekly, and NPR just named it one of the best books of 2014, as did Slate Magazine. So it's done. It's from a literary audience. It's been very well received, but at the same time, there have been responses like the UK Telegraph and even New York Times kind of think that the book is a piece of shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that.
Say whatever you want. Well, why would they say that?
Well, it kind of goes to the style of the book. For example, the piece in the Telegraph where the book got a 1 star out of 10. I don't even think that they gave out 0 stars. So the lowest response you can get. The rating was very low, but what they wrote about the book was everything I intended. I used to always tell my manager, Julian Rosenberg, that my goal here is to write a book as rich as Disney wore, the James Stewart book about Disney's corporate history, a book as rich as Disney wore that read like the Da Vinci Code. And so the book was sort of panned for being like the Da Vinci Code, that it was like, it feels like a movie. It's very accessible. It's very quick paced. It's very narrative driven and character driven, and some people don't like their history that way. So it has, seen a fair share of negative reviews, but luckily, I would say 75% of the reviews have been pretty incredible, and 25% have thought it's one of the worst books ever written. So,
well, there's always going to be naysayers, right? But I think that they're wrong. Honestly, I think they're wrong. I think it's fantastic. It's one of the best books I've ever read. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I love video games. I love this story. I'm learning about things that I didn't pay attention to as a kid. So it's a nice little, like we talked about at the beginning, it's like a little flashback and insight into your childhood. So there's the nostalgic or personal connection I have with the book. But at the end of the day, what you wrote is art, and it's subjective. And there's going to be people that don't connect with it, that they have no interest in the content. And as far as the style goes, if a book, or a game for that matter, if a piece of entertainment isn't fast-paced and gripping and accessible, I don't want anything to do with it, because I'm an adult and I have a kid and I can't waste my time.
No, well, thank you so much for those kind words, and I agree with you. I think that, I've always been the kind of writer and the kind of creator that believes, above all else, it needs to be entertaining. There should definitely be a message in there, and it should be well written. But if you're not entertaining people, then get out of the way. And I know that not everyone agrees with that sentiment. But I wanted to make this a really engaging and compelling book, and my ideal reader throughout writing it was always my grandmother. She knows nothing about video games other than that I desperately begged her to buy them for me when I was younger. And I thought if I could write a story completely set in the video game world that was interesting to her, then I will have achieved my goal of, just telling an interesting story. And for those that love video games, that's what it's all about. And there's a lot of great Easter eggs, but for the people who don't know anything about it, I want to make sure that they make it through the book, and that they understand why this is important to them and to their lives, even though they don't play video games.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. You wrote it for Grandma. That's really cool. That's really cool. Well, Blake, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'm really honored that you would do this. Thank you. I didn't find you on LinkedIn, though. I found you on Twitter. So maybe in 20 years, when the next Console Wars book is written, they'll track you down and other people through Twitter. That's the new LinkedIn. So people can find your book in a variety of places. I got it off of Kindle through Amazon.com. It was referred to me by a friend. I'm going to refer it to everybody here that's listening. It's a fantastic, fantastic book with a lot of great insights, and we've only scratched the surface here in this conversation. There's a lot more depth to it and some really cool people that you get to learn about as well. But where else can people find the book?
The book should be available wherever books are sold, and of course online at Amazon and BarnesandNoble.com and everywhere. And there's also a great audiobook, and it's great because the narrator, Fred Berman, is just an exceptional storyteller. He's currently starring in The Lion King on Broadway, and he does all the voices of Tom and Hayao Nakayama. And so there's an audiobook that you can get at Audible or also on iTunes. Anyway, any place where books are sold, Console Wars is sold, and I think you will enjoy the book.
Awesome. You can also go to consolewarsbook.com to get a little bit more information. You can find us on Twitter at Geeks with Wives. We also have a Thursday night comics podcast called Geeks with Wives and Capes, or as I call it, the Comics Podcast. That's on Thursday nights at 8 p.m. You can find them at GWW Capes Crew. You can find Blake Harris on Twitter at Blake J. Harris NYC, right?
Yep, that's correct. And I love talking about the book and answering questions. So whether you've read it or you haven't read it, please find me at Blake J. Harris NYC and ask me questions or tell me about your console experiences.
Outstanding. Well, thanks again for joining us. And guys, we will catch you next week.
This has been a production of the Geeks with Wives Podcast Network. Please don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes and Stitcher. Also, check out geekswithwives.com for all the latest news on video games, comics, movies, cosplay, and more.